I honestly think he did it because he wants to see if he can get away with it.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The New York Times has actually picked up on Bryan's neuroticism in one of their latest articles. Now, as a critical thinker, I worry that sometimes my work amounts to a sort of Don Quixote chasing windmills. You've got the passion, you've got the verve, all the intention, all the motivation in the world. The only problem is the problem or solution you're convinced you're attacking isn't really there. So it's definitely gratifying to see the fairly cerebral psychological surgery that we did recently echoing somewhere else. It's not a case of being a lone voice clanging stupidly in the wilderness. The New York Times have just now picked up the same line of psychological inquiry I have and come up with similar but not quite the same results. That's in the headline, Idaho murder suspect felt no emotion and little remorse as a teen. And the subtext to that is messages and online posts from the PhD student now charged with 4 murders show that he was once detached and suicidal before he became fascinated with criminals' minds. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind, we are doing a very special live Q&A where we're going to be reviewing and taking some of your questions and comments regarding where we are in terms of this case. What do you think of the criminal psychology conversation that has been taking place? What do you think about the social media and the documentaries that have come out? What is the biggest question still dogging this case? And that is posed in the poll, so make sure you answer that. Why has Whitman County sealed the search warrant? Is there a serious and imminent threat to law enforcement? Well, if so, what is it? So look out for the live stream. It's about 5 hours after the time I posted this video, or 7 p.m. Eastern. That's 5 a.m. my local time. If you're enjoying this video, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I beg to differ with the New York Times. I don't think it's true to say overall that Kohberger was an emotionless or remorseless teen. It's true that he felt those emotions at times, that he did feel suicidal, he did feel detached at times. We know this because he said that. My understanding is that the opposite is actually true. Instead of feeling nothing as a teenager, he was overwhelmed by these feelings. Feelings of anger at being mocked for his weight, feelings of shame and humiliation when he reached out to girls and they threw things at him or chased him away. I don't think he lost all that weight, all the weight that he did lose, and transformed himself while at school because he felt nothing, but indeed because he felt so very much. I also think if you think about the spectrum of feelings that teenagers generally go through, I don't know whether I would say Bryan Kohberger felt less than they did or whether he went through more than they did. I do think he is one of those people that doesn't and perhaps can't show his feelings on his face. He has a fairly flat affect. He does have some social awkwardness. That doesn't mean, though, that there's no emotion there. The heroin episode was likely the cause of some of those feelings of detachment and numb feelings, along with ordinary garden variety anxiety, except the anxiety was anything but ordinary for him. And I think in the same way that the anxiety was sort of off the charts in a sense, I think the emotions were off the charts as well. I think there is a link between one's emotional experience and one's anxiety. The New York Times, thankfully, at least echoes this link between Bryan's anxiety and isolation and visual snow. Their expert says that the presence of visual snow is not a sign of mental illness, but noted that one research team found that people who have the syndrome also report a high incidence of psychiatric issues, such as anxiety. So I don't really like labels, and it's very easy when you start talking about psychology to get locked into one label or the other. And so you once got to humanize it, one's got to talk about the psychological narrative in a way that feels real, in a way that we can associate with and identify with, right? And so I want to say that simply being isolated, simply being very alone for any person, for any length of time, is a source of anxiety. It can eventually manifest as deep existential anxiety. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with the world? Am I going crazy? And the delusions and paranoias that stem from the brain rot of spending extended periods stuck in your own mind is actually kind of a natural result of that. That you are not balanced by people around you, sort of reminding you that perhaps you being a bit excessive. You're not balanced by others around you, bringing you back down to earth, right? So it's also gratifying that Koberger's own friends from childhood have adopted the same term I pulled out of Becker's psychological hat, neuroticism. So quoting from the article, Thomas Ahrens said, "I know it was something that really bugged him. He was basically to the point where he was neurotic about it." And I believe that is a reference to Koberger in terms of his diet, in terms of his eating. He avoided sugar and starch. According to Ahrens, he wouldn't eat any bread and he would only eat certain fruits. It was a very restrictive diet. I've just had another look at the article. I think the reference Thomas Ahrens is making is actually to visual snow, the fuzzy vision. He was neurotic about that. But wouldn't you say he was also neurotic about his diet? And then wouldn't that lead you to think that he may have been neurotic about other things? Perhaps his interest in criminology, perhaps his frustration with being involuntarily celibate. The New York Times also notes something else that has been underestimated about Bryan. Not just that he was in a psychologically messy place once upon a time, but that it was so bad, his despair so acute, that he was suicidal. Quoting from the article, in online post by Mr. Koberger dating from when he was a teenager, he berates himself and talks about feeling disconnected from society, unable to find meaning in life. He describes an array of mental health challenges, including anxiety, depression, depersonalization, lack of emotion, and the constant thought of suicide, end quote. And I do think it's true, anyone who becomes suicidal is more than capable of becoming homicidal. As recently as May 2018, which is just really 4 or 5 years ago, Koberger wrote to his friend Bayliss, "I only used when I was in a deep suicidal state," and I think that's a reference to heroin. And he'd been friends with Bayliss since the 8th grade. He went on to say, "I've since really learned a lot. Not a person alive could convince me to use it." Mr. Koberger followed up later that day, telling Mr. Bayliss that he had been off drugs for 2 years and telling him to not mention his drug use again, according to screenshots of their conversation on Facebook Messenger. Quite interesting. Basically saying, do not mention my drug use again. So if he had been off drugs since 2016, that means he must have started around 2012. But the visual snow narrative goes back to about 2009. It makes you wonder what flicked the switch from anxiety leading to a suicidal state to anxiety, basically just the same garden variety thing, leading allegedly to homicidal thoughts. Well, first of all, the Bryan of high school wasn't studying criminology in the early phase. Secondly, he would have had a personal sense that he deserved love and support, deserved friends and companions, given his personal journey to lose weight, to clean himself up, educate himself, and look and sound the part of respectability. Think about his personal journey as a young person compared to your own, or compared to the average journey. I mean, he had gone from security guard and a loser in and out of rehab to some kid even his lecturers respected for his sparkling intelligence. from junkie to PhD graduate, well, almost. That is quite a journey. Even his classmates said that they sometimes couldn't even recognize him. The transformation was so staggering. And yet he still wasn't getting the social traction he wanted, neither with male friends nor with the opposite sex. So how it may have gone from suicidal to homicidal is the emasculation becomes more severe in an existential sense, and linked to that is the entitlement he felt, maybe even just the expectation he felt that he shared with the kids around him. I deserve to be as happy as you are. I deserve just as much as you. I deserve to have the social agency you enjoy. So why isn't it happening for me? And then within that, the obsessive fascination with criminology fills in the meaningless blank to that question. Bayliss also adds that he thought that Coburg had been depressed since he was 5 years old. And as a result of that, I guess, profound and ongoing loneliness, he developed a weird sense of meaning. What does that mean? Now, I've speculated that part of Bryan's problem was that he was mollycoddled at home. He wasn't encouraged enough to socialize, to take risks, to be in the world. We also know his own father held a grudge against his uncles, his father's siblings, and that may have to some extent isolated the family from other relatives. So it would be interesting to know what he spent his time on as a kid when he withdrew. What television did he watch? What games did he play? How did he self-soothe during those many hours as a child when he was depressed and alone? Because that's the default setting he developed when he developed that weird sense of meaning. The New York Times quotes him saying, "I'm thinking more along the lines of dealing with high-profile offenders," he wrote, counseling. And I think that's in terms of the career direction he wanted to take. It may be that Koberger is the first high-profile criminal, right, if he committed this crime. The first high-profile criminal that has been born, that was created by the high-profile true crime genre itself. Hence, what you think, you become. The difference between him and us is he wasn't part of a community, and his sense of not belonging felt very real on a practical level, on the level of a student, someone who goes out and he sees so many people, everyone around him, seamlessly pairing up or forming friendships, whereas the world seemed to see him as a creep and a criminal from the get-go. At some point, this altruistic approach of trying to save the world from itself starts to ring a little hollow for him, doesn't it? They hate me, and I hate them. So why would I want to save them? Consider that moment where the lecturer sort of has Bryan stand up in front of the class of 150 kids and says, well, go at him. And he's being criticized by at least 75 kids at the same time. What does that actually feel like? What would that feel like for you to be criticized in a public setting like that, given your self-esteem? Now, what do you think that may have felt like for someone like him, with an already battered and bruised self-esteem? Wouldn't it be, they hate me and I hate them, so why would I want to save them? I want to kill them. And that feeling finally manifests in a fantasy, one that finds traction in his obsessive exposure to the criminal mind, but more likely the high-profile serial killers that he sees occupying the apex of that world, the Dahmers and the Bundys. Within the apoplexy of his studies, his anxiety-riddled neuroticism begins to see a quick but unusual route to agency. Look at the awe and respect serial killers have in our society. They make documentaries about them. Reporters and everybody else fusses about them. They aren't invisible, and there's no question surrounding their lethal agency. People respect them, people fear them. And hadn't he wondered all his life, hadn't he thought, why am I different to everyone else? And maybe that's not because of anxiety, but because I was born different. I was destined for the dark side like Anakin Skywalker and Kylo Ren. Now, you may think this is a stretch, but in terms of the media narrative, I'm talking about cinema and so on, one of the things that has played out recently in the past in Star Wars is this whole idea of someone who grows up as a Jedi and loses her way, and she doesn't know whether to choose the light side or the dark side. And there's a moment where this Jedi looks like she may actually choose the dark side, that she was actually born to basically become part of the dark side. Her great-grandfather or grandfather is an evil person, whatever, right? Could that psychology have been part of his psychology? Was he a Star Wars nut? Think about these statements. Let the past die. It's the only way to become what you were meant to be. Your son is gone. He was weak and foolish like his father. You know I can take anything I want. I'm being torn apart. You're nothing, but not to me. Right? You're nothing to the world. And so, hadn't he taught himself during the heroin episode, why not just give in to it? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I do think what is quite interesting is that Adam Driver and Bryan sort of resemble one another. They both sort of got fairly big eyes, big noses, dark hair, quite tall. They've got a similar sort of weirdness about them. So one wonders, did he identify with that particular story? It's just a question. Bear in mind, it's a young person, and you may not be that interested in Star Wars, but young people are. And this was particularly a story of someone who loses his way and gains power in the dark side. Isn't that what happened here? Someone couldn't find power pursuing the light, and then they ultimately chose the dark side. Why not just give in to it? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time at that live Q&A. Have a look for the link at the end of this episode.